What is up, guys? So today I'm going to be going over a question that a lot of people have asked. Is it worth it to buy the Gunprimer RASER for about $25? Or could you just get cheap glass files off of Amazon? We're going to dig in and do some testing, and I'll let you guys decide. Let's check it out. So like usual, this video is not sponsored by Gunprimer. At least if they are sponsoring me, they haven't told me yet. I bought both of these razors with my own money, and I also bought both of these files with my own money. So out of these 4 files right here, we're actually only going to be focusing on 2 of them. The RASER 1.5 and the RASER Plus are essentially the same, at least in regards to this comparison. And this file right here was actually linked in the comments on one of my videos. Someone was saying that this is a good alternative because it's a 400 grit glass file. However, this is more like a sanding stick than a nano glass file. I'll show you guys when we do some of the testing, but I'm not going to count it in the final decision. So our test subject for today is going to be the high-grade heavy arms kit. I haven't built this one, so I'm pretty excited. It's actually my first heavy arms kit as well. So we are going to grab some of these dark pieces and go ahead and do some testing. So I chose these gray parts right here because they're pretty similar in size. These two specifically actually look like they're the same piece. So let's go ahead and get started with the razor. I trimmed down the nub as well, that way they're short. Here is the other part as well for a fair comparison, and we're going to go ahead and file away. And here we have the finished part. I'll throw up some pictures as well so you can get a closer look. Now we're going to file it with the cheap Amazon nano glass file. So that first nub actually took a long time to file down, so what I'm going to do is trim down the other nubs a little bit more just to make it a little quicker. So now these nubs are almost flush with the part, but they could still have a little benefit from some glass filing. And now we have this part finished off as well. I'll throw a picture up there so you can get a closer look, but effectively it is the same. So comparing these 2 parts, I can kind of tell which one I used the cheaper glass file on. The reason for that is there's some deformation on the edges of the part because I was using a little bit too much pressure. But the thing is, with this file, you kind of have to use a lot of pressure in order to take off more material. Now we're going to check out the other 2 files for these 2 remaining parts, and we'll see how they do. Up first, the RASER Plus. And here we have the finished product. I'll throw a picture up so you can get a closer look, but if you didn't notice, this one took significantly less time to remove the nubs. And lastly, we're going to use this file. It's not a nano glass file, but it technically is a glass file, and it is pretty cheap. I'm going to throw up a picture for this, but I'm pretty much going to stop right there for this part because as you can see, it doesn't necessarily work the same. It works more like a sanding stick. It doesn't give that polished, clean surface. And that's why we're not really including this one in the comparison. So the cheap Amazon file does get you the results you need. However, it did take longer and there was a lot more room for error. The RASER, on the other hand, is more expensive, but it does save you some time. But I have one more thing to show you, and it's this super scientific method to compare them. Using paper. So I took a couple macro shots of each of the files and I found out something really interesting. So all 3 of these files, the cheaper Amazon file, the RASER 1.5, and the RASER Plus, have the similar design where it's a bunch of little circles set up in a specific pattern. However, one thing I noticed on the Amazon file is that the circles were much larger and the gap between them was much smaller. Interestingly enough, the circles on the RASER 1.5 were also smaller than the ones on the RASER Plus, even though the RASER Plus technically has a higher grit strength. So what does that mean exactly in terms of files? Well, I'm going to show you with these pieces of paper real quick. So imagine we have our part right here. This plane would be the surface of the part, and say this is our nub right here. Here we have a traditional sanding stick magnified to show the sharp ridges all over it, and imagine we want to sand away at this nub. If we were to rub it back and forth along the nub, it would easily get picked up by the teeth, pretty much the same way a saw would cut through wood. However, if we are off axis from the nub, we do have that chance to scratch into the part. Because the teeth are so sharply pointed, they can easily dig into the plastic of the part. That's why when you're using sanding sticks, you gotta be pretty careful. Otherwise, you're gonna scuff up some areas that you didn't intend to scuff up. Next, let's bring in our generic nanoglass file. So the main problem with the sanding stick is that these sharp edges would dig into the part, causing scratches. We eliminate that problem by pretty much cutting off the top of those edges. That leaves us with a flat surface that we can lay against the part, but there's still these ridges right here that have cutting action. So if we were to rub it against the nub, we still have this flat surface to protect the surface of the part. However, one thing you might notice here is that it doesn't have that much room to grip material. So with a sanding stick, if you were to take the distance between the two ridges, line it up against the surface of the part, we would be able to take off about this much material of the nub with one pass of the tooth. However, we're going to line up the generic nanoglass file up against the edge of the part, and from tooth to tooth, we can only take off about this much material. So that little chunk right there is a huge difference between using a sanding stick and using this cheaper glass file. So what Gunprimer did with the razor is they kind of mixed the two together. That way we get more cutting power like a sanding stick, but we also get the protection of a glass file. So here we have the paper cutouts of the razor as well as the generic nanoglass file. If we lay it on top of each other, the pattern is literally exactly the same. That's because I cut them from the same pattern. However, I cut a little less off of the top for this razor template. Now what that does, if you remember the macro pictures, it'll give us smaller circles with larger gaps. Whereas here with the generic nanoglass file, we have larger circles with smaller gaps. And so now if we line it up with our part and make sure the edges aren't overlapping, we can take off material that's pretty much equivalent to that middle line right there. So it's somewhat of an in-between the generic glass file and a sanding stick. It doesn't necessarily take off as much material as a sanding stick, but it definitely takes off more material than a generic glass file. One thing I will say is this difference is definitely minimized the smaller the nub is. I have one more example here with a much smaller nub compared to this one. And so we'll take the generic nanoglass file, line it up with the part, and so we still only get about that much that we're able to take off. We'll do the same thing with the razor, and the line I have there pretty much overlaps with the generic glass file. So in many ways, the razor is very similar to a generic glass file that you can get on Amazon. However, one is $25, one is probably about $9 for two of these. If I were to give the pros and cons of each of these, 1, the generic glass file comes with a case. That's something you actually don't get with the razor. 2, the generic glass file you can actually see through, so you're able to see the surface of the part that you're working with. The main negative thing about this is it doesn't cut larger nubs with enough speed. However, with smaller nubs, it seems to be fine. That's exactly why I had to trim down those nubs earlier when we did the cutting test. Now the pros with the razor are pretty much the exact opposite. These cut way faster. Because the gaps in the holes are much larger, it's actually a little bit easier to clean them as well. However, for the cons, you can't see through it, it doesn't come with a case, and it costs just as much as 5 of these. So there is my most unbiased as possible comparison between the two. Of course, I'm going to keep using my razor because it's one of my favorite Gunpla tools, and I think it's one of the most innovative tools that's been brought into the Gunpla universe. But if you're trying to stay on a budget, these definitely will still work out for you. You might have to put in a little more work though. So let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. If you do have a razor, let me know if you feel like it's worth it. Anyways, I guess I gotta keep building this kit. So while I do that, you guys go ahead, pick up your own glass file and start building.